Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome the members of council, staff, and members of the public to discuss the proposed zoning bylaw amendment and call this May 13th public meeting to order. And I'd like to just touch base regarding the property details. The amendment application was submitted by Mr. Phil Williamson, agent for 10005888401 Ontario Inc., known municipally as 411 Wingfield. This is a public information session held for the purpose of public engagement under the Planning Act with the public, council, and staff. During a public information session, no member discusses or otherwise deals with any matter in any way that materially advances the business or decision-making of the council. I'd like to ask Mrs. Pearson for the land acknowledgement, please.
Thank you. We acknowledge that this land on which we are gathered today is part of the ancestral land of the Chippewa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi peoples, referred to collectively as the Anishinaabe. The town of Petrolia is located on the lands associated with the Huron Tract Treaty number 29 of 1827. We express gratitude for the land where we live, work, and play, and we are committed to working respectfully with the land and the Indigenous peoples who have called this land home.
Thank you, Mrs. Pearson. The purpose of this meeting is to afford the public an opportunity under the Planning Act to receive information relating to the proposed amendments of the Town of Petrolia zoning bylaw and provide input to town staff and council in relation to the proposed. The applicant proposes an amendment to the Town of Petrolia zoning bylaw 63 of 2017 as it applies to lands municipally known as 411 Wingfield Street and currently zoned general commercial C1. The owner has requested a site-specific rezoning from the C1 to exception 8 to the residential 3 R3-8 zone to permit the existing two-story mixed-use building to be converted and used solely as a multiple dwelling with a maximum of 18 dwelling units, comprised of 14 one-bedroom units, 3 two-bedroom units, and 1 three-bedroom unit. 2 of the proposed one-bedroom units are to be in the cellar. The applicant is also requesting reductions to the required parking space dimensions and required number of parking spaces, as well as recognition for the existing building and site conditions for gross floor area per dwelling unit, lot area per dwelling unit, front, exterior side, and rear yard setbacks. The proposed development complies with all other provisions of the R3 zoning applicable to the subject lands. This meeting is specific to the application noted above. Any comments you wish to submit in relation to a draft plan of the above application shall be done at the appropriate time to that specific application. At this time, I'd just like to introduce the council members present. On your far right is Councillor Hyatt. And next is Councillor Patel, Deputy Mayor Field, Councillor Clark, Councillor O'Hara, Councillor Welsh, and I'm Mayor R. Brad Loosely. And I'd like to ask Mrs. Pearson to introduce the staff present, please.
Thank you, Mayor Loosely. I will start to my left. We have our Director of Operations, Mr. Mike Thompson, our Director of Parks, Recreation, and Facilities, Mrs. Julie Bullock, our Deputy Treasurer, Annette Strand, our Senior Planner on loan / hiatus, but currently with us, Maria Kosarazzi, and also joining her is our incoming Senior Planner, Trevor Benjamins. We have our Director of Marketing, Arts, and Communications, Ms. Larissa Ellsworth, our Deputy Clerk, Human Resources Manager, Jessica Smith, and I am Mandy Pearson. I'm sorry, I forgot our CIO. I'm looking right at him. No, nothing. No apologies there. Our CIO and Treasurer, Mr. Rick Charlebois, and I'm Mandy Pearson, the clerk.
Thank you, Mrs. Pearson. I'd just like to request Mrs. Pearson to notice, please.
Absolutely, Your Worship. So all of these were consisted in accordance with the Planning Act. The Petrolia Independent, the notice was advertised on April 23rd, 2024. Email and mail to required agencies on April 23rd, 2024. It's posted to our website and our public notice section on April 17th, 2024, and was sent to by traditional mail to our surrounding properties per the Act on April 23rd, 2024. Therefore, we have satisfied all requirements under the Planning Act.
Thank you, Mrs. Pearson. So at this time, I'd like to ask Mrs. Maria Casarosi, our senior planner, for her report, please. Excuse me just for a second. I wonder if maybe you could switch places to speak into the mic, so it'll be picked up. Thank you. Thank you, ladies. Whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Would you like me to restart?
No, I don't think so. I think just go ahead.
So currently, the existing building previously contained retail offices on the main floor, which have been vacant for a few years. And there are still currently 8 one-bedroom units on the second floor, which are accessed by exterior stairs at the rear of the building. The proposed units for the main floor will front onto Wingfield Street with access through individual front doors. And the 2 and 3 bedroom units will occupy 2 floors with the living and kitchen areas on the main floor, with the bedrooms located in the basement, and accessed by stairs inside each separate unit. There is there are 2 of the 1-bedroom units that are being proposed to be located in the cellar area. There is a small outdoor green space proposed at the main entrance for the main floor units, but also an area for all tenants to enjoy at the rear of the property, just adjacent to the parking space area. The proposed development or reconversion has planning merit and is consistent for the most part with the provincial policy statement, county and town official plans, and the intent of the zoning bylaw. However, the request for parking reduction is problematic and cannot be supported from a functionality standpoint. The potential for multiple renters with vehicles given there are 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units proposed, combined with the proposed limited on-site parking spaces and no access to public transit year-round, and the lack of overnight street parking or parking lots will potentially create conflicts with abutting commercial areas in the downtown core and historic district. There has also been coverage in the media about the difficulties with parking and the need for more education for residents and the users of the downtown area. There's increased traffic in the downtown core area, new businesses coming in, and primarily the parking that is provided in those areas is to maintain and sustain that commercial area. The request for the parking reduction is 30%, and it is quite high. And although in some other areas that are introducing new housing, they are introducing relief for parking, but given the location and the community of Petrolia and the lack of parking there in that there currently is, it does raise a concern for the conflicts that could arise from the need from residents or tenants that could potentially inhabit these units. There is a recommendation. I know that the applicant had attempted previously. There's been a number of iterations and proposals for this site from the applicant. They had initially looked at a 3rd story to add additional residential units, and at that time they did seek out other opportunities for additional parking, and they weren't successful at that time. However, I'm not aware of the extent of the efforts that they have made to seek parking opportunities elsewhere in the community to address their potential need. And as I stated, a 30% reduction is quite high. As certainly other layouts could potentially be reviewed. We have had discussions with the applicant about potentially doing angle parking, and I know that that's not a favorite approach by most individuals. There are currently 21 parking spots on the site, even though they're non-conforming to the current standards. But I think that this information needs to be communicated in order to ensure that council has all the information before them to make their decision. And that's why in the back of the report as an attachment, the draft zoning bylaw amendment, the two areas that planning staff have a concern with in terms of the parking, the proposal to decrease from 1.5 parking spaces per unit to 1 parking space per unit. It's highlighted in the back, just pending the direction and decision that council would like to undertake. At this time, I don't really have any other comments in terms of the report. The report was, the material was circulated. We did receive some comments back from Enbridge and the St. Clair Region Conservation Authority, and they had no concerns. The proposal, the redevelopment proposal was reviewed by a number of departments as well as agencies, and building services and fire did comment on the proposed 2 1-bedroom units in the cellar area. Planning certainly had some concerns about that because it is prohibited from a public health and safety perspective. However, the applicant and building services, planning and fire services, we worked together quite diligently on this issue, and building services and fire services are satisfied with what's being proposed in terms of larger egress windows, the increased height in the cellar area. So planning has no concerns with respect to that particular area. Also, the applicant has worked closely with us and fire services when the fire services expressed concerns with the green space closest to the fence in the back because there was not sufficient space for emergency vehicles to access the property at the back. The 8 units that are currently there on the second floor, their access is through exterior stairs. So, and then the 2 proposed cellar units, their access would be at the back as well. So this was certainly something that was noted, and fire services actually brought the vehicles on site to ensure that they had sufficient room. So we've worked closely with the applicant, and they have agreed to remove the green space strip there to improve the access for fire services. So that also, I just want to point out that we have been working very closely with a number of different departments and with the applicant on addressing some of these issues.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. Causa-Rosie, for your report. We'll move on to the correspondence first before I open it up to the public. I'll ask Mrs. Pearson regarding the one correspondence, and I believe council all has a copy of that, but I'll have the clerk read that, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. So this was the only piece of correspondence that was received into our offices. It was sent in on by Mr. Al Randall on behalf of Anne Randall. She is a 420 Albany, and she owns the vacant lot at 420 Albany and Walnut Street, and has provided proxy to Mr. Randall for his email submissions. So we did accept that on her behalf. She would like to use her 2 area property notices to vote against seeking reductions to the minimum required gross floor area per dwelling unit, number of parking spaces, and length of parking spaces. And would also like to express concerns with converting the cellar to 2 dwellings without proper egress for the safety of the future tenants. All responses to Ms. Randall and concerns and submissions can be accepted at her proxy's address.
Thank you, Mrs. Pearson. So at this time, I'll open it up to the public. Is there anyone here wishing to address council regarding this proposed rezoning? Please come forward to the mic. Please state your name and address, please.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just for clarification, I am the representative of the applicant team. So I don't know if that's if now's the time or if you wanted to hear from the general public first.
No, go ahead.
Okay, sounds good.
Yep.
My name is Mike Davis. I'm a partner with Civic Planning and Design. Address is 201-258 Richmond Street, London, Ontario, N6B 2H7. I've skipped ahead and introduced myself, but we'll start again. My name is Mike Davis, and I'm a partner with Civic Planning and Design. We're an urban planning and design studio based in London. Here this evening on behalf of my client, Phil Williamson. was the owner and developer of this project at 411 Wingfield Street here in downtown Petrolia. I'm really excited to be here this evening and have the opportunity to speak to all of you, and in general be reaching this milestone with this project, which will see this mixed-use building converted into a fully residential 18-unit multiple dwelling. The property itself, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It's basically right across the street here, but it's an existing two-story structure that's set up in a mixed-use configuration. So the upper floor right now, as it exists, contains 8 small one-bedroom apartments, and then the main floor contains 4,600 square feet of what would be commercial space. Mr. Williamson acquired this property about 2 years ago now. In early 2022, he closed on the property. The residential units, those 8 units, were fully tenanted at the time, while the ground floor commercial space was vacant. The ownership team, they did spend a period of 8 to 10 months marketing the ground floor commercial space, but during that time did not receive any legitimate interest or offers for the space. The proportions of the space, the ceiling heights, are not really conducive to modern commercial users, so it's not the most desirable space for that use at the current time. The great quality about the building is that the interior space is very well suited to conversion to residential use, and so from that perspective, this project presents what's a really interesting opportunity where we can repurpose and breathe new life into this building, convert it to a new use, which will serve a really important need in the community for attainable rental housing options, bringing people downtown where they can access day-to-day needs, truly at their doorstep, and supporting all the business and economic activity that's happening here in the downtown. So that's the positive, and that's why we're excited to be part of this project. This strategy of converting vacant commercial space to residential use, it's been gaining steam across the province. We're actively working on half a dozen of these, and even in smaller communities across Ontario. It makes sense. It's a viable means of addressing housing. But having said that, these projects are not easy, and primarily, the reality with these conversion projects is that these are existing buildings and existing properties. Many of them developed years before current development and zoning kind of regulations. So what happens is that in an analysis and in a planning evaluation, we try to fit these projects in a very rigid box of the same standards that we would apply to brand new developments in greenfield areas. It does create regulatory barriers to achieving this kind of housing. By and large, we're supportive of the recommendations from the planning department and appreciate all the work that's been done to get us here this evening. What I do want to kind of speak to is the recommendation about the parking rate. We have reviewed the planning department's report, which we received kind of late Thursday afternoon, and we were admittedly disappointed to see that recommendation where planning department is suggesting applying a parking rate of 1.5 stalls per unit, whereas the application was for 1 stall per unit. I think there's a number of very strong points of analysis that led us to calibrating that parking rate at 1-to-1. I just want to quickly, as briefly as possible, kind of touch on those 4 points just so you have that information. The first thing that I would point out that I did not see in the planning staff report is that the 1 stall per unit ratio requested is actually in alignment with the existing residential parking requirement of the C1 zone. So your C1 zone, that applies to, by and large, majority of properties in the downtown. Residential uses are very commonly allowed in the downtown, normally in a mixed use format where you have commercial uses at grade, residential above. Within that style of development, the existing parking rate is 1-to-1. So that was point number 1, which is a pretty key guide to help us calibrate that parking ratio. There's some observations. Obviously, as I said, Mr. Williamson has owned this property for about 2 years now. When he purchased the property, those 8 existing apartments were occupied. Based on information from Mr. Williamson, 4 of 8 tenants own vehicles in those apartments right now. Mr. Williamson has had turnover over the course of that 2 years, and that parking ratio of about 50% has remained static. I think the other piece is around, what this project is and what it's geared for, and what's actually kind of going to be built at the end of the day. So there will be 10 new units introduced. 4 of those units, the ones on the ground floor, are being specifically designed as barrier-free units, geared and marketed towards those with mobility challenges. Overall, they're quite small units geared towards singles, seniors, other demographic segments looking for entry price point rental housing. By and large, multi-car households are not as prevalent in this market segment as others. Okay, so the other piece on that is Mr. Williamson's own property management efforts. Of course, it's in his interest not to lease to folks with multiple cars if the supply does not allow. So that'll be a key component in his property management strategy is the lease up and how parking is advertised. To supplement all of that, there are some short-term parking publicly available options nearby, which would provide just a basic opportunity for visitors as needs arise if there was a need. That includes some timed street parking and a municipal parking lot within close walking distance. And I think, what I always find is the kind of ironic part about, some of these kind of downtown redevelopment projects is that the attractiveness of this from a good planning perspective is that this is a location where folks can have access to all of their daily and weekly needs within really close walking distance. And that's absolutely a good planning principle and something that municipalities across the province are trying to achieve. But then, unfortunately, the recommendation here from planning would effectively oversubscribe the amount of parking needed to a point where the project would not be viable. So that's the kind of conundrum we're in. The last point I want to make just on the parking, through this application, on paper, we are effectively improving the parking situation. So under the existing C1 zoning, as I alluded to, there's a range of commercial uses that would be permitted on that ground floor. Those commercial uses oftentimes have a higher parking rate than the residential uses that we're proposing to replace them with. So for example, if medical dental clinic has a permitted use, if we were to lease the entire ground floor as clinic space, that would require 23 stalls on the ground floor alone from a parking perspective. So from a intensity perspective, this conversion strategy actually is a solution, in my professional opinion. So sincerely appreciate all of your time and consideration this evening. I'm going to be available to answer questions, as will Mr. Williamson. Our ask is that this application be approved with the 1-to-1 parking ratio as requested. Thank you so much.
Wait, just before you go, Council, any questions? Councillor Welsh.
For you. Do you know what the parking increase would be if you did try the angled parking? How many spaces you might gain, and what is the reasoning for not attempting that?
Yeah, for sure. I can speak to that. So unfortunately, right now, the parking area behind the building, again, the building's quite old, and the parking area, the dimensions of it are such that they don't meet modern zoning standards. And so what happens with the angled parking configuration is you actually lose the number. It's a net loss in the number of stalls, because when you have an angled configuration, yes, you can kind of fit more stalls, but then there's not sufficient dimension to have a drive aisle behind those stalls to make them accessible and for people to be able to sort of maneuver in and out. So with an angled configuration, unfortunately, it actually results in a lesser amount. Currently, right now on the property, there is kind of an angled parking setup. That angled parking setup is enabled by basically what amounts to an illegal pass-through connection to an adjacent property. Okay, so there's informal kind of circulation that happens between this property and the adjacent property. What we'd be proposing to do is actually legitimize that. We would close it. We're going to introduce some green space in the form of a common amenity area. But in doing that, it means that to maximize the amount of parking we can provide, we actually go to more of a traditional perpendicular style.
Councillor Welsh, okay. Daniel, okay. Deputy Mayor Field, go
Yeah,
ahead.
through you. And I'm sort of directing this to the planner, but to one of your points, if you could just clarify, so if I have a building on the main street that has commercial below, I have 2 apartments above, I'm only required 2 parking spots?
So I actually, thank you through your worship.
Go ahead, yeah.
I just wanted to address one of the planner's comments, and that is in terms of the required parking, the zoning is clear that for multiple dwelling, it is 1.5 parking spaces per dwelling unit. Except that it makes an exception for a senior citizens apartment building. Now, we did have discussions throughout this process where the applicant was asked if this was going to be for seniors specifically, or if it was going to be for affordable housing in terms of low to moderate income households. And the response was no, that it was going to be for market rent specifically. But in terms of the reference to the 1 parking space per dwelling unit, the zoning is clear that for multiple dwelling, which this is being rezoned to, the requirement would be the 1.5. So each type of use normally has a specific requirement. And if I can just have a moment to review it, I can respond to the question. I think the other thing that I'd like to be noted is that when there is a business on the main floor, they are the individuals who are accessing the business and the services, they are there during business hours. So the parking that is available on the street or available in the lot is being used normally from like 8:30 to 4:30 or 9 to 5. So the conflicts that have been identified in the report, they are more related to the need for overnight parking, or if you have visitors that are staying, there is really not a mechanism in place on the site to address those specific issues.
Councillor Field, go ahead.
Yeah, just to
Sorry,
follow up,
Deputy Mayor.
maybe through you again, to your comment. So if the owners right now decided to put a restaurant on the bottom floor, they could do that. We have requirements around parking for a restaurant. With your analogy of a doctor's office, it's only during business hours. A restaurant is, they could park on the road as well. We're enforcing for them to have the right amount of parking spots. So I'm not sure why a doctor's office wouldn't have required spots as well.
Through your
Okay.
worship, yes, they would have required spots as well, but I think depending on the use, it has specific requirements. So in terms of a restaurant, it's based on the square footage of the building. It's also, there is also flexibility within the bylaw that if there is insufficient parking on site for commercial uses such as a restaurant, that there is the ability within 150 meters for them to access parking elsewhere and enter into an agreement with that property owner. For example, it's been done in the past here in Petrolia where commercial businesses have access property on, let's say, a religious site or a church that has excess parking that's not being used all day, every day. So there is that option. The mixed use building in and of itself, it lended itself to that main floor being for that commercial retail space, whereas the second floor was strictly for residential needs. So it would really depend on what kind of business is being proposed on that main floor to be able to sufficiently answer in terms of how many parking spaces would be required. The parking that is required, it's required to be on site. It is not meant to be off-site. If it is meant to be off-site or portions of it off-site, then it is in essence up to the developer to provide those options for us to be able to review and determine if they're viable.
And just one last question,
Deputy Mayor Field, go ahead.
to you, how many residents are actually residing in the building currently?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I would just ask my client, Phil, he can speak to that better than myself.
They are currently? Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Any other comments or questions from council? Seeing none, thank you for coming to address
Thank you.
this committee, this council. I'll open it up for the public again. Anyone else here wishing to address council at this time? Okay, come forward, state your name and address, please.
Irvin Sullivan, 424 Wingfield. The only problem I've got with this as you say, parking. If you've got 18 units sitting there and you've got 12 parking spots, who's gonna put, where's the other cars parking?
Or excuse me, Aaron, address your comments to the chair, to me, please.
Yeah, that's it. And when they retrofit this building, is it going to be 1980 fire or 1920 or 2024 fire prevention?
Well, I would think it would have to meet all the requirements, but unless Mrs. Koza.
Because like the building was built in 1980, and a lot of these places in town right now are being retrofitted. I mean, you got a 3-story house. There's 6 apartments in it.
I still
And
think
this,
that,
and this is the same as over here. Is it up to the 24 standards or the 1980s? I mean, it's been a couple of years since I've looked at the fire book. But anything over 3 apartments has got to have all interconnected fire smoke detectors.
I would think no matter what they do, would still have to meet all the building code requirements, including fire restrictions. So I can certainly state that that has to meet code, whatever the code is, like today. So I don't think you, I guess I'm trying to say it, whatever it would have to meet all the building code standards.
But some of the people are going back to when the
Okay.
house was built
All right, I'll get to
or the
Deputy
building
Mayor
was
Field,
built.
go ahead.
Sure, just through you, just to add a comment. I believe, and our planner can tell you that the fire chief is part of that process. And when they went through this, the fire chief sits on that committee and actually goes through to make sure it's up to the standards. The same way they looked at the parking at the back and brought the trucks. And I think to the 1.18 units is what they're recommending is 18 parking spots, not 12. So, but our fire chief is part of it.
No, I'm just saying,
Yeah.
saying 12 as an example with
Yeah.
18 units.
All right, your point's well taken, but I certainly, I believe all the people involved would have to approve it before anyone could get occupancy permits. So, but your point's well taken and it's recorded here.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else wishing to address council at this time? All right, seeing none, this bylaw will be considered by council for approval and debated on Monday, May the 27th. And if there's nothing else, if there are any clarifications or questions from council at this time? Seeing none, I'll declare this meeting officially closed. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Mike.